1. About 7 years ago, I went to Ghana, West Africa with my mum. She is Ghanaian, and I am Black British, but we were visiting our homelands together. At the time I was 14, but my childhood was not an easy one. So I was and still am as sharp as a bullet. My mum owns a small hotel business abroad, like 5 rooms, and she had hired her cousin, so my distant cousin I think, to take care of the business when we weren't around. She took him out of a village that had no electricity or gas, and he had been the caretaker of my mum's business for as long as I could remember at the time, whilst my mum and I are in London. Now I know that sounds very nice of my mum, but she can be a ruthless woman. She is the source of my greatest pain and my greatest love. But she can be a little brutish and cold, and she will never let anyone fuck with her. She's gone through some in Ghana, and her journey to get to London illegally was quite the James Bond story. But anyway, onwards. We found out that he had been stealing money from her. So that was the purpose of our flight. We surprised him at the hotel by just turning up randomly. The next day, my mum sacked him, which means he would have to pack his things and go back to a very poor mud hut in his village. Akwasi has a wife and 3 kids, all of whom are in poverty too. When this happened, I wasn't at the hotel. I was in the city centre, in Accra, in a very populated market with my mum's friend. However, for some reason, as I was walking out, a sudden sense of terror washed all over me. I am 21 years old now, and since I am a people person, talkative, social, etc., but has also gone through some shit, I am good at reading people and I follow my gut because of these things. Anyway, I told my mum's friend that we should go back to the hotel. I was on autopilot when my body just started moving on its own, and suddenly I was sprinting back to the hotel, and he kept telling me to wait as we ran. When I got there, the woman staying in the hotel was standing outside crying. And she looked at me and hissed very low, "Run, or he will kill you." Both me and my mum's friend are like, what the fuck? When I arrived, the back entrance to the small hotel was wide open. I bolted into the corridor and found my cousin, standing outside a locked room with a machete and a passport, screaming at the top of his lungs. I immediately hid behind the corner so he couldn't see me. And in my language he said, "I'll fucking cut you like a butcher with his meat, you and your daughter. This is my building now." My mum's friend stares, freezes up, and then bolts out the door of the hotel. The way the hotel is set up, you can enter the main gate and take a left to get to the small car park, or just come through the car park, where you can see into the windows of one or some of the rooms. Because of the high rates of armed robbery in Ghana, like full-on guns, knives, and gangs bursting into your house, stealing your shit and killing you in cold blood, loads of houses have iron railings around their window to prohibit entry, but it also prohibits exits. I ran back outside and dragged a chair from nearby, next to the window of the room that was locked, and my mum was crying behind the door, shaking. I have never seen her like that in my life. She saw me and she froze, and then vomited onto the floor. I mouthed to her that I will rescue her, and she shook her head and told me to run. Anyway, Akwasi, Crazy Machete Man, rounded the corner. I screamed and ran the other way. He chased me, but there was distance between us, so I managed to crawl under the huge car gates and tell my neighbours. They kind of already knew, because my mum's friend who took me to the market had already told them. Then they went and called the chief of the area, and in about 3 minutes, over 10 huge fucking men are following me and my mum's friend to the hotel. My mum is really kind when she wants to be, and had helped these guys out by bailing them out of poverty. They disarmed my uncle and beat the shit out of him. I then found out that he had been holding my mum's passport in an attempt to stop her from leaving the country. Anyway, My mom comes out of the room and she's really shaken up. My adrenaline crashes when she's in safe hands. I'm shaking really badly. We hold a group meeting about my cousin with the close neighborhood members in the hotel, but I sit outside because I'm too scared to sit indoors with my cousin, Akwasi. Then my mom calls me inside, but when I go in, Akwasi is absurdly nice to me. Anyway, I kind of ignore him because I'm really scared. He makes me and my mum a mug of hot tea and chocolate as an apology for losing it earlier. The other neighborhood members are drinking some tea too. I glance at my mum, who is blowing the top of the tea because it's really hot. Then I stare at my mug, and for some reason, staring at that cup of hot chocolate made my blood run cold. I asked my mum who made the tea, and she says Akwasi, but she agreed to not fire him due to his circumstances. At the time, I chided myself for being paranoid. But I'm so glad I followed my gut. I refuse to drink it. It is 2 p.m. and it's dry season in Ghana. It's so hot that it would be stupid to drink hot chocolate at this time. The drink looks fine, but something seems off. Its color is slightly gray. So I lean over and smell it, and it doesn't smell bad, but it smells chemically, like a strong mosquito repellent kind of smell. My mom can't smell it because she's been crying, so her nasal passage is blocked. She picks up her mug to have a sip, because my mum loves tea, and I tell her that mine smells weird. I give it to one of the elders of the neighborhood to smell, and they agree it smells quite sharp. She puts the cup back down before she can have a sip, and suddenly the cup's rim is black as fuck. When my mum asks Akwasi what's in the cup, he doesn't even miss a beat. He doesn't hesitate to tell her that it's loaded with rat poisoning. We keep a bag of it behind the fridge just in case we have an infestation or something. At this point, my whole body feels like molten lava. I have never and I will never feel that kind of blinding, hot rage in my life again. I remember launching myself at Akwasi, who was over double my age. I remember digging my fingers into his eye sockets and sinking them as hard as I could until I drew blood. I understand why people can be blinded by anger. When I came conscious of my actions, I was being hauled tightly by a tall, black, hulky man and hyperventilating like crazy. My stomach was scratched, and the bruise on the side of my face was huge. Anyway, Akwasi said he wanted to commit suicide like an hour and a half later. My mum hands him both cups of rat-poisoned beverages and tells him to down them both and do the world a favor. Crazy cousin of Accra, Ghana. Let's never meet again or I will rip your soul right out of your body, you lowlife piece of shit. 2. At the time of this story, I was 20 years old. I am now 27, and I should also mention that I am female. I was working part-time in the cosmetic department at a drugstore, working mostly evenings, being a student and all. I was never overly afraid of being there at night. It wasn't a bad neighborhood at all, middle-upper class, and there were always at least 4 people working in the store at a time. However, regardless of the neighborhood we were in, idiots will be idiots, and the theft rate in our store was at an all-time high, and it was usually targeted in the evenings. The company was a fantastic company to work for, and they genuinely cared about our safety, and of course the products that were going missing, so they hired a security company to help cover the store in the evenings, mostly the cosmetic department. I should also mention that although there were always other employees in the store, the cosmetics department is pretty secluded, and there was only ever one employee, usually a female, scheduled in a department at a time. Because of this, the company of a security guard was definitely welcome to help pass the time on a long, quiet night. I worked 4 evenings a week, and another girl covered the other evenings, and it was for the most part the same schedule each week. There were a few different guards that would come to our store, but on most occasions, it was this one male, I'd guess around 25 years old. Not unattractive, and very friendly. Let's call him Mike. Mike would come in his uniform and post at our counter, and basically scare away potential thieves by doing just that. Quite often, we would chit-chat and pass the time having idle conversation. I am very talkative, pretty much an open book, and sometimes too forthcoming with personal information. I began noticing that on my shifts, it was only ever Mike on duty, and asked him about it, to which he replied, "Yeah, you're just stuck with me now. Everyone else has other postings." That was entirely possible. I didn't think much of it. That is, until I went to the store on one of my nights off to pick something up, and saw that there was a different guard there with the other evening employee. We'll call her Sarah. I said hello to Sarah and the other guard, and said, "Oh, it must be Mike's night off." To which the other guard replied, "Mike only works Sunday through Wednesday." Well, that caused a little lump in my throat. That was my exact schedule. Has to be a coincidence, right? 20-year-old naive me thought so. On with my life I went, not worried about a thing. The things that followed were a series of minor creepy encounters with Mike. Running into him at the movie theater in my town, when I knew from previous conversations that he had lived in the town 20 minutes away, which had its own theater with the same showings. Having him show up at my work on a day that I took an extra shift, in uniform, claiming he was on his lunch break, and now gets his prescriptions at my store instead of the one near his house due to better service. I asked the pharmacy tech if he had a prescription filled, and she said no. The next thing still gives me the chills, not in a good way. And is when I started being not so friendly to this guy. I also want to make it clear that on many occasions, while having conversations with Mike, I had mentioned my awesome boyfriend. There is no way he thought I could be available or interested in him. After a vacation that Mike took with some friends, he was back to working the same shifts as me at the drugstore, and I was remaining neutral towards him, still having conversations to pass the time. He asked if I'd like to see some photos he had taken on his vacation. It was a road trip, so he had a ton of scenery pictures, etc. I said sure, and took his phone from him. He said, "Just keep swiping left to see all the pics." So I'm scrolling through, and one swipe too many, and I'm looking at a full-blown dick pic. Of course, I kinda jump, stutter a bit and say, "Oh, whoops, I think I went a bit too far there," and pass the phone back to him, thinking it's a total accident, and he clearly sent that to a girlfriend or something. Except he isn't embarrassed at all. He replies with, "I was hoping you'd see that." And the creepiest grin I had ever seen. Chills again typing this. I was all of a sudden very busy, and didn't have time for chit-chat that evening. The next morning I placed a call to the company he worked for, and explained to them that I thought he might have a crush on me, and I was feeling slightly uncomfortable. I told them I didn't want to cause a scene, and was hoping they would just change his location, or at the very least his schedule. I sometimes have too much compassion, and didn't want to get him in trouble, and was worried maybe he thought I would like his dick pic for some reason and that it was my mistake. Like I said, sometimes I overshare and maybe he got the wrong idea. I was thrilled the next night when I went in and there was another guard in the store. I was grateful that his supervisor had listened to my concerns. However, when myself and the rest of the closing crew locked up for the evening, we heard a car's engine start up just as we left the store. When I looked for where the sound was coming from, it was in the corner of the mall parking lot, which was completely empty and dark, and I felt a knot form in my stomach when it was the same vehicle that Mike drove. I had seen him pull in multiple times, as the front of our store by the cosmetics department is all windows. Although I couldn't quite make out the exact color of the car, I was convinced it was the same. I was trying so hard to convince myself It was just someone with the same vehicle, also closing up for the night. The car drove out of the parking lot, which made me feel better. When I got to my car, I noticed a note under my wiper blade. It read, "I'm so sad that my location got changed. We'll try to come back to your store as soon as I can. In the meantime, let's get together," with his phone number. I'm basically puking in my mouth from nerves at this point. I jump into my car and get the hell out of there. The next day I called Mike's supervisor again. This time told him the whole story and asked he relay the message that I'm not interested and to please leave me alone. I also told my store supervisor, who was a pretty awesome guy, who responded with an "Aw, hell no," and placed a call to the supervisor as well, asking that Mike be advised not to step foot back on our store's premises. I didn't see or hear from Mike for a few weeks after. Thought I was in the clear. I hadn't told my boyfriend anything at this point. It was a fairly new relationship and I didn't want him to be weirded out by it. Weeks later and I am barely thinking about Mike and his forceful advances, when it is a very rainy evening and I am at work setting up a new fall collection. When it is raining and dark, it is very hard to see out into the parking lot of the store. Basically, all you can see in the windows is the reflection of yourself and the store. I was over by the windows, bent over putting some things on a bottom shelf, when a car honked outside the window. Of course, I looked up to see what was happening, and as I did, over my shoulder in the reflection of the store, I could see Mike standing behind me, just standing and staring. I think I jumped a little, probably peed a bit, tried not to make like I even saw him, although I'm sure he knew I did, and hustled to the other side of the store, where the same manager who I told the story to was working. When I told the manager, he ran back to the cosmetics department, but Mike was gone. We later watched the whole thing on camera. That evening, my manager placed a very angry call once again to Mike's supervisor, who told us Mike had quit the week before, after being told to stay away from our store. Yikes. You may be wondering why no one called the police at this point, but honestly, it just didn't seem dangerous enough. No one was getting hurt. It was just kinda creepy. That's it. Until I had finally told my boyfriend about it, and my parents, and I stopped driving myself to work. I had developed a bit of a fear of going to my car alone at night. Therefore, either my boyfriend or my mom or dad were driving me and picking me up from work. Except this one night. My parents were out of town and my boyfriend had a thing to go to this particular Sunday evening, so I drove myself. After closing time, I said my see you laters to my co-workers and walked to my car at the end of the parking lot. The parking lot has a river at the end of it, with some benches overlooking the river with zero lights at nighttime. The only lights are the ones shining from the middle of the parking lot. I know, super safe spot to park, right? In my defense, the parking lot was always completely full when I got to work. So I'm walking to my car and I see nothing. And then I hear someone speaking. I immediately recognize it as Mike's voice. He's saying something like, "Why would you do this to me? Why would you make me believe you wanted me? We had so much fun together." As luck would have it, the pharmacist that had closed with me that night wasn't yet in his car and he took the garbage around the side of the building to the bin. I yelled, "Jim, wait up a second," and hightailed it over to his vehicle where I said, probably a little too loudly, "Call 911. The police arrived and scoured the area for Mike, who was gone without a trace. I never saw him again. Mike, let's not meet again. Deal? 3. This happened in the mid-90s. I was about 5 years old and my family decided to go on a trip to Fiji over spring break. My parents, aunts and uncles grew up there, so we weren't solely there as tourists. The first few days we stayed with relatives and got the local experience, which was a lot of fun, honestly. It was mine and my older brother's first time there. There was a big group of us visiting, me, my brother, a handful of our cousins around the same age, and all of our parents. I was the youngest. After visiting relatives, the adults decided to rent a beachside house for the remainder of the trip. We were all really excited about the view and being so close to the beach. The house was really big too. To this day, it's the biggest and nicest house I've ever had the chance to stay in. Anyway, we swam, hiked, sat around a bonfire, and did all the usual outdoorsy stuff. The first night was so much fun, and so deeply ingrained in my memory. The second night, however, the adults decided to go out for a few hours and leave the older kids to take care of the younger kids. They weren't going to be gone long. They said they would come back at 10 o'clock at the very latest. And the house had a security system installed, so no one was really worried about anything happening. Plus, it was the 90s. Being the oldest of the kids at 17, my brother was left in charge. We had 3 cousins with us, 2 boys, 11 and 15 years old respectively, 1 girl, 15 years old. I was rooming with my female cousin, and the boys were rooming together, while the adults had their own private rooms. So I was the youngest by a long shot. Anyway, us kids decided to go to the beach while the sun was still out. An hour or 2 max. We packed up our beach gear and took off. The house was still in view, we didn't stray too far away. We were basically just in the backyard. My female cousin, Joanna, didn't let me out of her sight. In fact, she stayed with me and built sandcastles the entire time. We took a bunch of pictures on her disposable camera, some of which are still tacked onto her fridge all these years later. We're still really close, and I look after her young daughter all the time. So, the older boys swam out and did their thing, while Joanna, Eric, 11, and I stayed behind and played on the beach. Our plans of staying out for only a couple of hours soon turned into 3. It was only as the water became a little too aggressive that we decided to go back inside the house. Because my brother's an idiot, he forgot the key to the back door in his room, so we had to use the front door of the house, which required walking all the way around the gate and down the dirt road out front. We packed up our shit and took off, the 5 of us. It was pretty dark at this point. Joanna and I held hands the entire way. Eric was walking with us, while my brother brought up the rear and my older cousin, Dean, took the lead in front. We kept quiet while we were walking back, all of us tired from being out all day. Joanna and my brother exchanged a few words here and there. I was so tired. I had no idea what they were saying, and I didn't care. My only concern was sleep and Game Boy. It was only as Dean slowed to a halt in front of us that I realized something was awry. There was a man walking towards us from the other side of the dirt road. I was very young at the time, but I remember the look of this man's face very clearly. He was old, Caucasian, very tan, and adorned in typical male tourist attire, consisting of a tropical shirt, cargo shorts, sandals, and a straw hat. His clothes were straight out of a tropical getaway catalogue. There were other houses in the area being rented out by people, so we all just figured he was in a neighbouring property, walking home or something. Even so, my brother cut in front of Joanna, Eric, and I, just in case, and slowed at the same time the man did. The man introduced himself as Eddie, and said he was lost, looking for directions to the house where he was staying. He appeared to be under the influence, kind of glassy-eyed and wobbly. He couldn't stand perfectly still. There was some swaying, and for whatever reason, his eyes went directly to Joanna. He would periodically look at her while my brother was giving him directions. It was around this time that Joanna, who had been holding my hand, squeezed my tiny fingers inside her slightly bigger ones. I could tell she was nervous. Even then, at 5 years old, I sensed that there was something seriously wrong with the way this man was looking at her. Eric, who up until that point had ignored me the whole trip because he wanted to look cool in front of the older boys, took my hand, and the three of us stood together like a shaky wall between Dean and my brother. I couldn't really hear the words that were being exchanged. I just saw my brother gesturing as he was giving directions, pointing his arm back, to the left and whatnot. This lasted maybe 5 minutes before we were on our way. My brother made sure to walk beside Eddie for a minute, all the way past our shaky wall, and then he waved by, and we all carried on to our house. The older kids exchanged a look with each other but didn't say anything. In fact, we didn't speak of Eddie at all. We entered the house, showered, and met in the kitchen for something to eat. My brother cooked for us and we sat around the table, talking about how much fun the beach was, and then we heard a knock at the front door. Expecting our parents, we didn't really think anything of it. The older kids were too lazy to get up and answer it. But Dean eventually caved. He went to the door and I, being the curious 5-year-old, went with him. There were windows and a peephole on the door where Dean could have looked, but he didn't. He unlocked the door and opened it, his body language turning rigid as he met eyes with Eddie. Within seconds, Dean was on the defense, and he glanced back, motioning for me to go away and grab my brother. I waited a couple seconds before doing it, catching Eddie as he asked Dean if he could use the phone in our house. Apparently he was too far away and the long walk was killing his legs, so he wanted to call a cab. This was before the age of everyone and their mother having a cell phone, so showing up on someone's doorstep, asking to use their phone wasn't terribly out of the ordinary. I skittered off to the kitchen and motioned for my brother to follow me. I guess he saw the mildly anxious look in my eyes, so he immediately dropped his food onto his plate and went to the door. Like Dean, his body went rigid when he saw Eddie. The three of them spoke at the door for a long time. Eddie was begging to use the phone while Dean and my brother said they couldn't let him inside. They said if he really wanted to use it, he should wait until the adults come home and ask them instead. By telling him this, however, they had let slip the fact that us kids were home alone. They must have been going at it for at least 10 minutes. By this time, Joanna came out to see what was happening. I remember she rocked back when she saw Eddie at the door, breath catching in her chest. She glanced down at me and nodded for me to join Eric in the kitchen. I usually wouldn't have listened, but that night I did. I went back to the kitchen and told Eric what was going on at the door. Even though he was older than me, he used to get scared really easily. To this day, he's still very jumpy when it comes to horror movies and things. For this reason, he swallowed the dry lump in his throat and yanked me back when I took off to see what was going on. Sometime later, Joanna and Dean returned to the kitchen without my brother. I raced past them, poking my head around the corner to see that my brother had let Eddie inside the house, standing with him as he used the phone. It was attached to the wall in the long hallway. My brother leaned against the wall and kept his attention firmly on Eddie as the man dialed the number for the cab company and called one to our address. This took about a minute, after which Eddie thanked my brother and waved bye to me on his way out. My brother kept the front door open after, standing there and watching for a solid 20 or so minutes until the cab arrived and drove Eddie away in the back seat. Our parents came home maybe 10 minutes later, a car full of groceries in the trunk. As per my brother's request, we decided not to tell our parents about Eddie. If they knew we let a stranger inside to use the phone, they would have blown their shit, rightfully, but still. We were kids, and my brother tried to sort the situation out as best he could. Plus, Eddie didn't really do anything per se. There was just something about him that was odd. The rest of the night went by without a hitch. In fact, 2 nights went by without anything weird happening. By this point, we had all forgotten about Eddie, at least I had. Joanna, on the other hand, kept a huge kitchen knife under her pillow just in case. I had no idea at the time. She told me this years later. On the fourth night at this house, the adults cracked open the barbecue outside, and we had a little cookout in the back. It was a really good time. There was good food, cold drinks, a deadly game of Monopoly, and even a little bit of storytelling from my slightly inebriated uncle, aka Dean and Eric's father. My parents told me I could stay up late with everyone and everything, which I hadn't been allowed to do the entire time we were there thus far. Suffice to say, we were all having a good night. The stars were out, the waves were crashing softly on the shore, and the mosquitoes were biting the fuck out of us. My mother went inside to grab some repellent, and didn't return until a couple of minutes later. She went straight to my father after, without the insect repellent, and whispered something to him, a weary look on her face. The others noticed, eventually asking what was going on. She told them some strange man was at the front door, knocking repeatedly. My father and sober uncle, Joanna's father, went over to check what all the fuss was about. They answered the door, asked Eddie what he wanted, who, to my memory, kept saying, "My buddy Will said I could swing by. Can I talk to my buddy?" Will is my brother's name. I remember thinking it was weird, the fact that he kept referring to my brother as his buddy. The adults found it very weird too. My father asked Eddie what he wanted, and why he wanted to talk to my brother. Eddie just kept saying Will was his buddy, and that he wanted to see him. He was very clearly on something. Drugs, alcohol, I don't know. There was something wrong with him. Eventually, Eddie said he needed to use the phone again, and that Will had let him use it last time. The jig was up. My father glanced back at Will as he came up to see what was going on, and gave him the death look, the "boy you done fucked up" look. He knew better than to let strangers in the house. But that was the thing. Eddie had a way about him. He was odd, but at the same time kind of disarming. You didn't know whether you wanted to knock him out or help him out. My father and uncle told Eddie he couldn't use the phone, but they did give him directions to the nearest convenience store where he could ask for directions, find proper help, etc. Eddie tried to persuade them into letting him use our phone, but they firmly told him he had to leave, shutting the door in his face immediately after. Sometime later, we all went to bed. Joanna and I stayed up a little later, and she read me a chapter out of the young adult novel she had been reading the whole trip. It was Flowers in the Attic, in case you're curious. Certainly not the most appropriate novel for a child of 5, but I had no idea what half of it meant anyway. Plus it was only the beginning. None of the crazy-ass tarred hair, resisting flesh, sleeping man stuff that went on later. In any case, I fell asleep, and a few hours later, I woke up to the sound of Joanna's voice. She shook me awake and said we had to hide in the bathroom for a bit. The look in her eyes was wide and full of fear, and without her telling me directly, I knew this was about Eddie. She took me by the hand and we locked ourselves in the bathroom. I noticed she kept touching the back pocket of her jeans, but I didn't know why. I later found out she had tucked the knife in there, and felt for it every few seconds to make sure she still had it. We hid for about an hour until we heard the police. I remember hearing their loud footsteps in the house, and I remember Joanna opening the door for them when they knocked on the bathroom to see where we were. I didn't know it then, but apparently Eddie had come to the house again while we were sleeping. The boys' room was really warm that night, so the three of them had left the window open. Apparently Eddie hovered by the window a second and quietly climbed inside. Eric, the poor thing, was the first one who saw him and screamed bloody murder, waking up Dean and my brother. Eddie's eyes were bloodshot, and he was twitching all over the place, climbing in and asking his buddy to help him find the sweet girl from the other night. He was referring to Joanna. Every screw in his head was loose, and he began laughing, shouting, and telling my brother they could take turns on her, amongst other obscene things, all at the same time. It's like he couldn't decide if he was horny or angry. According to my brother and everyone else who restrained and held Eddie down that night, there was something incredibly off about him, other than the fact that he had broken into the house. The way he was talking, he was so delusional, as though he was fully convinced Will was really his buddy, and that Joanna was really going to be his that night. It was apparently terrifying. To this day, my brother doesn't talk about it. He's the only one who refuses to recount his full version of the story. I think it has something to do with Eddie, really. Truly thinking they were old buds who had promised each other they would use Joanna like a rag doll. This man was so fucking convinced. Anyway, their screaming woke up the adults, and my mother called the police right away, while my father and 2 uncles held Eddie down until the cops got there. Joanna's mother raced upstairs and woke the girl up, telling her to grab me and hide until further notice. We had no idea if Eddie had come alone, but we were pretty convinced. My mother checked if the other windows and doors were closed and locked, and then she took Eric upstairs and waited with him in the hallway, trying to calm him down while the cops drove up. Turns out Eddie had some mental problems. He had become obsessed with Joanna after he first saw her. She was exactly his type, young, of colour, and unwilling. Oh, and we later found out Joanna wasn't the only girl he had harassed on his trip. But she was the only one whose house he had snuck into, in search of her. Who knows what would have happened if he'd climbed in through our window instead of the boys. Eddie, let's not meet again, buddy. Hey everyone, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to 3 True Scary Stories, episode 128. I'd like to give my thanks to all the good people who allowed me to use their stories, very much appreciated. I'd also like to point out that I just hit the 22,000 subscriber mark, so I'm extremely happy about that. That was a very nice thing to wake up to today. So thank you very much to everyone who made that happen, all 22,000 of you. And for those who subscribed and unsubscribed, well, you're not going to hear this, but thanks for at least trying me out. That's also appreciated. I'd like to apologise if my voice sounds a bit nasally or gunky or something today. I was drinking this, what is it called? It's an innocent something. Innocent garden greens. It's basically just smushed vegetables and vegetable juice and fruits and things in there. It's very tasty, but unfortunately it seems to have made me a bit, my sinuses a bit irritated. Maybe there's ginger in it or something, I'm not sure. But that's why I sound a bit weird if I do. So I'm sorry about that, but we blame the innocent smoothie people. I'd also like to say thank you very much to all of those of you who made suggestions about painting my bedroom ceiling. Very appreciated. I think someone suggested a dark grey, which I've got to admit the idea of that does seem kind of appealing to me, so I've been looking at dark grey paints. We do try to keep things interesting here in the Hellfreezer outros. We talk of many wonderful things, smoothies, paint. If you're interested, once I've done the painting, I'll record it drying, and I'll post that so we can all enjoy that together. Oh, I'm sorry, you would not like to see that. Okay, well, never mind then. I'll just stick to doing scary stories, since that's what you seem to enjoy. Thought you might like the wet paint, but no. Okay, and with that, I think I'm going to head off for now. So until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourselves.